Chapter 6, we're going to continue with our macronutrient discussion. In this case, though, we're talking about fats and other lipids. 6.1, we're going to identify 3 major kinds of lipids, list at least 6 functions of the lipids in the body, and list at least 3 important functions of lipids in foods. Lipids are a class of macronutrients that includes fatty acids, triglycerides, phospholipids, and cholesterol. In general, lipids are going to be insoluble in water. They don't like water. If you've ever put oil and water together, you know that. What they can be dissolved by are usually organic compounds, things like alcohol or acetone. If you ever get Vaseline on your hands, or you ever get Crisco on your hands, soap will work, but acetone or alcohol would probably work better to get it off. Lipids are also less dense. They're lighter than water. If you look over here, you'll notice that the water with all of the water-soluble things is at the bottom, but the oil is sitting at the top because it's lighter. As far as lipid functions go, you got table 6.1 that actually has all of the functions listed. Most of us think of providing and storing energy as a function of lipids, which is true. That is one thing that it does. But it also helps us to maintain cell membranes. Our cell membranes actually, for the most part, are made of lipids, whether that is the phospholipids or cholesterol, both of which are part of our cell membrane. Producing hormones. We have testosterone, estrogen, progesterone. All of these are hormones that are created from cholesterol, a type of lipid. Insulating the body against cold temperatures. We have fat under our skin, subdermal fat, that is intended to kind of be like styrofoam on a cup. Styrofoam on a cup is intended to keep the heat in. It's intended to keep the cold in. When it comes down to it, our fat under our skin is kind of the same thing. It helps us to stay warmer when we're in cold environments. Let's see. Cushioning the body against bumps and blows. So our kidneys sit halfway below our rib cage. And because of this, we don't have a nice bony cage completely surrounding them. With that in mind, we actually have a fat pad that surrounds the kidney. And that is there basically to prevent us from physically damaging the kidney if we bump our back into something. Instead, the majority of the blow would go toward the fat, kind of like having a pillow on top of it where the pillow takes the majority of it instead of the organ. Contributing to our body contours. Most people know that women have an hourglass shape, and that's because of our breasts and our hips. Our breasts are designed so that once we have a child, we can actually feed that child using breast milk. And our hips are designed to be well padded because when we are pregnant, we want to make sure that we're protecting the developing fetus. And finally, absorbing and storing fat-soluble vitamins and phytochemicals. So if something is fat-soluble, it will only dissolve in fats. Unfortunately for us, our blood and most of the way that we move things in our body is going to be using the watery environment of our blood. When it comes down to it, we do have vitamins, we do have phytochemicals that are fat soluble, meaning they will not go into water. So we have to piggyback those things on the fats that we are absorbing in our digestive tract. So that is actually a function. Numerous studies indicate high lipid consumption of certain lipids may increase the risk of serious health conditions, specifically cardiovascular disease. Some dietary fat, though, is actually essential for our health because of all of these functions that I've just mentioned. Now, 6.2. We're going to explain the differences in chemical structures of saturated, monounsaturated, polyunsaturated, and trans fatty acids, triglycerides, phospholipids, and cholesterol. We're going to identify major food sources of each kind of lipid, including the essential fatty acids, phospholipids, and cholesterol. We're going to discuss the roles of essential fatty acids, phospholipids, and cholesterol in the body, and we're going to discuss signs of an essential fatty acid deficiency. So fatty acids are going to be these long chains of carbons that are filled with hydrogens. So if you look over here, you'll see that I've got all of these carbons lined up in a chain, and I've got all of these hydrogens that are attached to those carbons. Now, normally, when we look at a fatty acid chain, you've got one end over here that has a carbon with 3 hydrogens attached. We call that the omega end. And then at the other end, we'll have a carbon with 2 oxygens and a hydrogen. We call this the acid group or the carboxyl group, okay? Fatty acids will vary in the number of carbons in their hydrocarbon chain. So when we say we have short chain fatty acids, we're saying that we have 2 to 4 carbons in the chain. When we say medium chain fatty acids, we're talking about 6 to 12. Long chain fatty acids are 14 to 24 carbons long. These, in all 3 examples, have 18 carbons. Therefore, they would be considered long chain fatty acids. Now, saturation. A saturated fatty acid means that the carbon atoms in this chain, every single one of them, will actually have a hydrogen in every position available. Carbon can bond to 4 things. So if I've got a carbon, like you see here, bound to another carbon, this can only, since it's already losing one of its bonds, it can only bind to 3 more things. In this case, we have 3 hydrogens, 1, 2, 3. Here, though, I've got a carbon and a carbon, so I'm already taking up 2 of the things that I can bond to. But those last 2 are going to be full of hydrogen. And you can see that every single carbon here in this chain has as many hydrogens as it can carry. So it's saturated. It's full of hydrogens. When we say unsaturated, it means that my fatty acid chain is missing some of those hydrogens because the carbons in the chain will double bond to each other. So remember, I can bond with 4 things. If I bond twice with one thing, that only leaves 2 more bonds. So when you look down here, I can have something that is monounsaturated, meaning that there's only 1 double bond because mono means 1. Or I can have polyunsaturated, meaning that there is more than 1 double bond. It can be 2, it can be 4. It doesn't matter. If it's more than 1, it's considered poly. Now, if you look at this example, you will notice that these 2 carbons right here have a double bond between them. And you'll also notice that because 2 bonds are here, this carbon has 1, 2, 3, and I said it could bind to 4 things. That means there's only 1 spot available for a hydrogen. Same here. I've got 1, 2, 3, so that means there's only 1 bond available for that hydrogen to bond to. And since in this whole carbon chain, I only have this 1 double bond, 1 monounsaturated. Now here in the next example, you'll notice that I've got 1, 2, 3 double bonds. That automatically means it's more than 1, it's polyunsaturated. And again, because there is not ultimate saturation here, that means that it is not saturated. It isn't holding as many hydrogens as it possibly can. The difference between fats and oils. Both fats and oils are technically triglycerides that contain fatty acids. Fats are solid, so you've got butter, for example. Butter at room temperature is still solid. And most oils are going to be liquid at room temperature. So manteca, beef lard, is solid at room temperature, whereas vegetable oil is not. So foods that are rich sources of long-chain fatty acids tend to be more solid at room temperature than foods with larger amounts of unsaturated fatty acids. So 2 polyunsaturated fatty acids cannot be made in the body and must be supplied by our diet and are considered essential. alpha linolenic acid, linolet, linoletic. I'm a sad, sad person that can't even say it. So I'm just going to call them omega-3s. Okay, so omega-3 fatty acid is that name. Linolenic acid is omega-6 fatty acid. And I'm sure you've heard in commercials and things like that of omega-3 and omega-6 because they sell supplements that have them and everything else. The body actually does use essential fatty acids to make DHA, hexaenoic acid, and EPA, eicosapentaenoic acid, and arachidonic acid from linoleic acid. They're all used to make several compounds that have hormone-like effects in your body, specifically prostaglandins. Prostaglandins can be used to cause uterine contractions. They can be used to regulate blood pressure. They can also promote the inflammatory response when we get bitten by a mosquito, when we get slapped on the arm and you see red, like swelling. That is all part of our prostaglandins, and we have to have the omega-3 and omega-6 in our diet in order to make those things. So 2 polyunsaturated fatty acids cannot be made, like I said, and we've got the same thing here. The essential fatty acid deficiency that may occur when we don't have this as part of our diet. It's actually fairly rare in the United States because as a society, we do consume a lot of fat. So how would we know if we have a deficiency? Our skin would become very scaly. We would experience hair loss. Part of inflammation, part of wound healing is inflammation. So we would have pretty poor wound healing. And unfortunately for infants, they experience poor nervous system development and they don't grow properly. So again, essential, we have to have it. Unsaturated fatty acids with hydrogens of double bonded carbons on opposite sides of a molecule rather than on the same side, as with more common cis double bond. Okay, when we talk about trans fats, trans is referring to its shape and where things are located. If you look over here, this is kind of more the normal form that we see in nature, where we've got the double bond with the 2 hydrogens, and it kind of looks more like a basket, okay? When you have a trans fat, instead of having the 2 hydrogens on the same side of these 2 carbons, one will be at the top and one will be at the bottom. And this actually does change the shape of this molecule. So instead of looking like a bucket or a bowl, you kind of have something that looks like a lawn chair. So this trans form, okay, isn't really found in a lot of foods. There are only a few that really have natural trans fats, meat, some dairy products. But research has shown that there are no health benefits to consumption of trans fats. Some research has shown that trans fats actually elevate blood levels of the unhealthy version of cholesterol, which increases the risk of heart disease. So trans fats aren't really a good thing to have in your diet. Just avoid them as much as possible, because I know since it's part of meat, if you eat meat, it's just going to be there. But just for your information. Now, partial hydrogenation. Food manufacturing processes that add hydrogen atoms to some unsaturated fatty acids in liquid vegetable oil converted many natural cis, or bucket shape, to trans fatty acids. They formed partially hydrogenated oils, or PHOs. Similar structure to a saturated fatty acid, so PHOs are more solid at room temperature compared to the oils with the cis configuration. So we're talking about taking something that would normally be in liquid form at room temperature and turning it into something more solid. Why did they do this? Well, what this ultimately did was it made them less likely to undergo oxidation. Oxidation becomes an issue because when food or these oils oxidize, they actually become rancid. They go bad. So when you get them into this trans configuration, they actually have a longer shelf life. So PHOs are unhealthy and can increase the risk of heart disease, like I said before. And the FDA determined that PHOs posed a health risk. Everybody and their mother started using these trans fats in their products so that their products had longer shelf lives. And they could leave them on the shelves longer, make less product, but it still sold. It didn't go bad. So for a while, it was all the rage to have trans fats in your diet. But then the medical community started noticing this rise in cardiovascular disease. And it finally kind of came about that they figured out that it was trans fats doing it. So when that happened and it came to light that the trans fats were actually causing more heart disease than normal or cardiovascular disease than normal, the FDA actually banned their use in 2021. Basically, any product that had added trans fats was not allowed to do that anymore. So now, if you look at labels, a lot of things will say no trans fats, even though probably to begin with there were no trans fats. So technically I could put no trans fats on, I don't know, a box of Fruit Loops, and Fruit Loops never had trans fats to begin with, but it says no trans fats. And since the trend was to put trans fats, and then we learned about heart disease, people are going to be all excited about eating Fruit Loops, that type of thing. So triglycerides. Tri means 3. Glyceride in this case refers to part of the molecule. This is a glycerol, and then the tri refers to fatty acid chains that are coming off of this glycerol, of which I have 3. So you have 3 fatty acids attached to a glycerol backbone. About 95% of the lipids in the body and in foods come in the form of triglycerides, whether that is fats or oils, because it can be both. But the body does store our energy when we talk about fat storage as triglycerides. The triglycerides in fats and oils are mixtures of saturated and unsaturated fatty acids. So these chains may be saturated, they may be unsaturated. Diets high in saturated fats, the one with all of the hydrogens, they actually have a higher risk of cardiovascular disease. It's worse for your health to consume those. Diets high in unsaturated fats may reduce the risk of more common cardiovascular diseases. So where do we find them? Saturated fat can be found in beef, in butter, in cream, whole and reduced fat dairy products, and coconut. Coconut oil is actually a solid at room temperature, so it's saturated. Monounsaturated, you've got avocados, olives, peanuts, pumpkin, sesame seeds, almonds, hazelnuts, pecans, fish. Polyunsaturated, you've got walnuts, flaxseed, and fish. Trans, places that you will find this naturally and not it's put in there after the fact. Well, we've got them in beef, we've got them in milk, and then, of course, since dairy products are made from milk, other dairy products. So looking at saturated, monounsaturated, polyunsaturated, and then other lipids. Safflower oil has 14.4% monounsaturated, 74.6 polyunsaturated, and 6.2 saturated. I'll be honest, if you're going to have anything, you kind of want to have monounsaturated. Technically, it's better for your health. You'll see why later. But this is when we have high linoleic in it. Safflower oil that has high oleic actually has a majority if you look at the 75.2% of mono unsaturated, 12.8 of poly, and only 7.5 of are saturated. That right there would probably be the oil that you'd want to use. But when you look down here at olive oil, this is actually really healthy. If you think I need something with a lot of monounsaturated, and olive oil is pretty easy to find. I'm not sure about safflower oil, specifically high oleic version, but I know that I can find olive oil. Avocado oil isn't too bad, but when we look at, let's see, where are you? Coconut oil. I've heard so much on TikTok about the benefits of coconut oil, blah, 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 right? But look at how much of it is actually saturated fat, the one that causes heart disease or cardiovascular disease. That isn't a good thing. And you can look at all of these and kind of gauge for yourself. One of the other ones that's really good is the sunflower oil that's high oleic acid. It's 83.6 monounsaturated. So yeah, you can gauge how much of each they have. And again, if you want the most beneficial, you're going to want monounsaturated. You'll see why as we go on. So another type of lipid we're going to talk about are phospholipids. Phospholipids are chemically similar to the triglyceride in the fact that you've kind of got a head with tails hanging off of it. But in this case, you have a hydrophilic phosphorus containing region, hydro, water, philic, loving, and then you've got two hydrophobic, water fearing tails that contain our little fatty acid chains. So one fatty acid is replaced by a compound that contains phosphorus and often nitrogen. Because of the structural change compared to our triglyceride here, you have that, again, hydrophilic and hydrophobic nature to this molecule, meaning part of it loves water, part of it fears water. This specific characteristic of this molecule actually allows it to act as an emulsifier. Emulsifiers will basically take big fat globules and break them into small fat globules and then surround them, which you're going to see. So food naturally in plants and animals. Lectin is a major phospholipid in food. Rich sources are going to be egg yolks, liver, wheat germ, peanut butter, and soybeans. Lectin contains choline. Choline is a compound that nerves actually use to produce a neurotransmitter called acetylcholine. Acetylcholine is a chemical messenger that allows your nerve cells to communicate with each other. Eggs are often used in cooking for their emulsifying ability. Again, so let's look at what an emulsifier does. Emulsifiers, because we've got those hydrophilic and hydrophobic parts, are substances that can keep water-soluble and water-insoluble compounds mixed together. Processed foods, like salad dressings and ice cream, often have emulsifying agents in them. So I'm going to blow this up so we can look at it. I want you to notice that the heads are all out on the outside and the tails are all in the middle. So I want you to imagine a basketball, okay, an empty basketball. And all along the outside where I can touch is going to be where all of these heads are going to be. Inside, going toward the center of the basketball, would be where all of the tails are going to be. They're all going to be facing inside. Now remember, the tails don't like water. Who else doesn't like water? Oil doesn't like water. So I can put oil in the middle of that basketball where all of the tails are surrounding it, because just like the oil, the tails don't like water, and they'll get along just fine. Now the outside is all of the heads of my phospholipids. All along the outside, I like water. So when I have this in water, the emulsifier can actually surround and kind of create a little chamber for my lipids inside of it. and it'll float inside the water because the heads don't mind being around water. And in the meantime, my lipid, my oil, is safe and happy in the middle of the tails because they also don't like water. So when we talk about emulsifiers, emulsifiers are able to take the oil and they're able to actually split it apart into smaller chunks, smaller droplets. So phospholipids in general are going to be major structural components of our cell membranes. Every cell in your body, the outside of that cell is made out of phospholipids. Other things too, but phospholipids are kind of the main component. So we've got this double layered phospholipid membrane. Double layered because I've got water on the inside of my cell. I've got water on the outside, I've got water on the inside. So having it completely covering the inside of my cell and the outside of my cell means that it can be near water. And then dead center in the middle between them, I've got all the tails. So again, go with me on a journey with a basketball. Imagine I can cut a basketball in half. And when you cut the basketball in half, if I touch the inside of the basketball, I'm touching the heads of phospholipids. If I touch the outside of the basketball, I'm touching the heads of these phospholipids. But in between those two layers, where the rubber is in the middle of the outside and inside, is where all the tails would be. So I've got some facing out, some facing in, but that middle section here, all of the tails are huddled together trying to escape the water that exists outside and inside of my cell. Now, this double layer of phospholipids allows for my membrane to be really flexible. Ultimately, I kind of think of a cell membrane looking like a pool with a whole bunch of balloons on it. If I hit the water, the balloons can kind of move around. The phospholipids give that membrane a lot of flexibility because they can move around, but because of the nature of them being hydrophilic and hydrophobic, they kind of stay in that orientation where they're not just going to fall apart. They're going to move this way and this way, but they won't just flip open because the tails don't want to be near the water. They are needed for normal functioning of nerve cells, including those of the brain. There is a video that is called Cell Membranes in your book, but I have actually added the videos to the end of this PowerPoint if you want to watch them as well. So, another type of lipid are sterols. I'm sure you've heard of cholesterol. So, sterols, cholesterol, they're very related. Something that makes them fairly unique is that instead of having these long chains of carbons, you have this ring structure that you can see right here. This is going to make them chemically more complex than the other lipids that we've been talking about, the triglycerides and the phospholipids, and it's going to make them fairly unique as well because everything we've talked about has just been a chain previously. Cholesterol is the most well-known sterol, like I said before. Many think of it as unhealthy and should be avoided, but it actually is a very important nutrient. It's an essential component of our cell membrane, just like our phospholipids. Cholesterol is a big part of that, and it is used to synthesize our vitamin D that we need for calcium absorption, estrogen and testosterone, which are hormones in males and females, and bile. Bile is the thing that we talked about the digestive system using to help us emulsify or break apart the big fats that we have so that we can absorb them. So bile is made by the liver to emulsify fats in lipid digestion in our digestive system. So, cholesterol contents. Sterols are only going to be found in animal foods. Rich sources include things like egg yolk, liver, meat, poultry, whole milk, cheese, and ice cream. So if you look here, the amount of cholesterol goes down as we go down, but whole milk has 24 milligrams. Liver, beef that have been braised That's 337 milligrams of cholesterol. That's a lot of cholesterol. Egg yolks have 186, and if you look, the yolk is what contains this, not the egg white. The egg white, barely anything. Sardines, 161, shrimp, 161, and you can see what has how much cholesterol. But again, it's only in animal foods. Now, plant sterols and stanols. Plants make small amounts of phytosterols, plant sterols, and phytostanols, plant stanols. They're not well absorbed by the human intestinal tract, but they compete with cholesterol when absorption is happening. What that means for us is we can reduce the amount of cholesterol that is available for absorption because we're competing with the phytosterols and phytostanols. As a result, they're added to certain foods, beverages, and dietary supplements because they lower elevated blood cholesterol levels. Again, when we're going to talk about cardiovascular disease a lot, but it lowers that risk factor for our cardiovascular disease or our heart disease.